This week on Just Solutions, the Poor People's Campaign is holding a moral march on Washington and to the polls on June 18th. They're calling on elected officials to make real policies to fully address poverty and low wealth from the bottom up. The event is the culmination of months of organising and rallies in communities around the country. Angela Montalvo, an organiser with the Poor People's Campaign in Nebraska, is a disabled Army veteran. She's one of the more than 32,000 vets in Nebraska with incomes less than $35,000 a year. Angela, who's speaking on June 18th, says we must fight poverty and not the poor. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Angela, it is so great to have you with us. Thank you very much for being our guest today on Just Solutions.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're the tri-chair of the Nebraska Poor People's Campaign. Why did you get involved with this?
So I first got involved with the Poor People's Campaign because I am a disabled veteran that kind of deals with not getting any disability payments from the government. It's just how my discharge ended up. So I am, kind of unable to work and living in poverty. My husband is a veteran as well. And I just kind of found this campaign that was really speaking to the issues that are important to me and so many people across the country.
Well, one of the things that the Poor People's Campaign does is really focus on the intersectionality of so many issues, from investing in our military or militarism, but also raising awareness about that, but also raising awareness about the state of poverty right now in the country. And you're really at the intersection of that because you were in the military, but now you are finding yourself in poverty because you are yourself a disabled veteran. Talk a little bit about the intersectionality of that, because there are so many statistics of veterans themselves who subsequently end up in situations like yours. What is the reality for veterans right now, Angela?
So in Nebraska, I am one of, the many disabled veterans living in Nebraska. We are about 25% of the Nebraska veteran population that are low-income veterans. And while my situation, I think, is kind of unique, it's definitely, the poverty issue is definitely a problem for a lot of veterans and specifically disabled veterans.
And poverty in Nebraska outside of the veteran community is huge. I know there are lots of statistics. I believe about a third of the people in the state of Nebraska are considered to be low income or living in poverty. Now, that's a huge amount of people, but it's also a huge voting bloc. And we're going to talk about what's happening with elections in just a moment. What does it mean to be low income or living in poverty in a state like Nebraska?
So in a state like Nebraska, it's very difficult to access so many things. I live in rural Nebraska, so I am really far from a city or any. I'm actually almost in Colorado, where I live. I live in western Nebraska. So it is really difficult for me to access anything at all. Even the Veterans Administration hospitals and things like that are hours away. And, when you're low income and can't really afford the gas to get there, that really makes things difficult. So yeah, specifically out where I live, it is just access to almost anything is nearly impossible.
I think there's a real misconception about what poverty actually looks like, and particularly what it looks like in rural areas, because so often we see images of poverty and low-income folks, but we see that in an urban setting when we see images on TV or how it's portrayed in the media. But what you're describing is very much a rural situation, which is really quite different. Aside from the distance and trying to access services, I mean, what are some of the other issues that folks in rural America, not just rural Nebraska, are facing, and what does poverty look like there when it comes to education, accessing services you mentioned there, but also, food and accessing infrastructure like broadband, which is so essential to so many people's work and education. What are some of the other considerations when we're talking about how poverty plays out in a rural community?
Right. So access to food is definitely a huge deal. We have like we have a good grocery store in our town, but it's very, food's very expensive right now. So for people living in poverty, like my family is on SNAP and we receive that money for food, but it's not enough. We get through part of the month on that money, and that is just really not enough. There's just so many things that are impacted by poverty.
So you say you get through part of the month. What happens when you hit that limit of SNAP and you still have days to go before your SNAP benefits renew? I mean, what does that look like?
Right now, we have some really great family members that help us out when we need it. But yeah, that's kind of how we get by when we don't have enough to get by on our own. Yeah.
I spoke earlier about how the Poor People's Campaign is really shining a spotlight on intersectionality. And it's how, we as a country have focused on investing in militarism and not focused on investing in poverty and raising people out of poverty, and also the connection then to environmental degradation. I mean, there is so much discussion when we talk about the military in this country around, how it connects to patriotism, how it connects to us as Americans. And yet we do not talk about the stories of what happens to veterans when they come home. And you've described yourself, you're a disabled vet, your husband is a vet, and you're living in poverty, and that you have to rely on family members to help feed your family when it comes to, the end of the month, before your SNAP benefits renew. How do we shift that conversation away from, watching a movie like Top Gun that, loads up the military and militarism in this country? And instead, how can we focus on the reality of what it means for folks like you who've served in the military, in the US Army, and then have come home and found yourself in this situation? What do we need to do as a society to shift that narrative?
I think that we need to generally stop celebrating war and militarism as a country. That is something that you're right, really links in with patriotism in this country, and it shouldn't. I think that we should really focus on the people, the individuals that have served their country, and then when they come back, they are not being taken care of by their government. My husband actually went overseas, came back, and used his GI Bill to go to college, and this year received a letter saying that there was an error in that money that he received to go to college, and now we owe over $22,000 back to the government. So they're taking his disability pension that he receives to cover that. So we're actually not even receiving that at the moment.
That's horrifying, Angela. You've just described the situation where when you get to the end of the month, you have to rely on family members for food, essentially, because your benefits run out. And you've just found out that you have to pay money back to the government for the education that was promised to your husband as a veteran. When you
Yes.
get a letter like that ultimately derails your entire economic reality, I mean, what does that do to a family like yours? Because I know you're not the only family who are in a situation, not necessarily an identical situation, but situations like this where you're literally living month to month. And so when you have something like this happen, it can completely derail everything. I mean, what does that mean now for your family?
It means that we are, struggling to pay bills, struggling to just, pay for everything. We have had so many utilities that have, gotten shut off, and we've again had to have family members help us get those turned back on. It's a lot, and yeah, like you said, just like the education was promised to us. When we signed the contract, that was the promise, was that our education would be paid for, and now here we are, not owing money for student loans, but owing money back to the veteran or to the VA.
Well, the Poor People's Campaign has, for the last several months, been rallying in communities like yours in Nebraska and various different states around the country ahead of a huge gathering in Washington on June 18th. And it's the Moral March on Washington, but it's also a march to the polls, because in addition to showing the connection between militarism and poverty and environmental degradation, there's also a huge focus on what's happening when it comes to the polls. And I know in Nebraska, part of your work as the Tri-Chair campaign leader of the Poor People's Campaign in Nebraska is raising awareness about some of these laws that are being passed in Nebraska to create more barriers for people for voting. So tell us about that, the voter ID law, and some of the other concerns that you have when it comes to election access.
Right. So in Nebraska right now, there is a petition gathering signatures that is almost certain to be added to the ballot this November. That is to add voter ID as a law in Nebraska. And that is just um, it's very discriminatory against poor people. It's difficult to access an ID, a state ID, as a poor person.
There's often a conversation when there's debate around issues like voter ID laws. And on one side, the proponents of it say, well, this is just securing our elections. And of course, people should have identification if they're going to do something as important as cast a vote. What you're describing is that it's not as simple as it's made out to be. When you're living in poverty, you have to pay for an ID. You maybe have to take time off or get childcare to go to the DMV. Or maybe, as you've described, Angela, you're in a rural area where the DMV office isn't entirely accessible and has very limited hours. That then looks as a way then that we're excluding many, many voters. So I know that you have been speaking out about this particular effort to get this passed in Nebraska. What are you hearing from other folks about what having a voter ID law would mean in Nebraska?
So many of the things that I really just described, but just very difficult. First of all, on the wording of the petition, it's not even clear what kind of ID would be necessary. It just says a accepted ID in the wording of the petition or something like that, I believe. So it's not even clear what you need. If it would be a state ID, or if like student IDs would be acceptable. It's that's not even clear. So yeah, getting access to a specific state ID, like I said, is just really difficult for a lot of people.
But we would love to hear from our viewers. Let us know your thoughts on this. We have been covering the Poor People's Campaign for many years here on Free Speech TV, including these community events that have been leading us up to what's happening on June 18th. Drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts about all of these issues that we're discussing, the intersection of militarism and poverty and environmental degradation. And then, of course, access to the ballot and efforts to suppress the vote and block many people from actually being able to vote. We'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation and let us know your thoughts. Well, Angela, we've been talking about this event on June 18th. It's a massive gathering in Washington, D.C. Many folks will be sharing their very personal stories of living with all of these issues that we've outlined. You yourself are sharing your story about what your situation is. How important is it that we hear these stories? Because so often it seems that when we're discussing policy around poverty or around militarism, we get lost in numbers, we get lost in statistics, but we don't necessarily hear the voices of people who are directly impacted. How important is it that we hear your voice and the many other people who are involved in the Poor People's Campaign?
It's so important. You're right. I mean, the numbers are important to kind of give you a representation of how many people are going through this, but hearing each individual's personal story, none of them are the same, but so many people are living in similar situations across the country. Through the campaign, I've met people from all 50 states, and people are suffering all over the country, and they are in different situations, but also sometimes very similar situations. And it is important that we hear those stories and let the public hear those stories so that they understand the personal aspect of what is happening to the statistics that you mentioned.
And what are the very specific demands of the Poor People's Campaign? What is the rallying call that you are calling on elected officials to enact as a result of what's happening on June 18th, but also these many, many months of organizing and raising awareness? What are the very specific demands?
So we are calling for a third Reconstruction to address the needs of the 140 million people living in poverty in the United States. We're calling to address poverty, to address systemic racism, the military and war economy, and ecological devastation. So many intersecting issues, like you said, but really pushing for a third Reconstruction in this country to address all of those issues together.
And so this is calling for policy that will specifically address what we're talking about. I mean, there have been some efforts, and maybe we could talk about how successful or maybe not successful they've been, but there have been efforts like during the COVID-19 pandemic where the child tax credit was extended and money was given directly to families. And there was research that showed that that made an absolutely huge impact, that that actually did lift people out of poverty. I mean, maybe talk about that, because when we see policy enacted, albeit on a short-term basis, that actually makes a difference when it comes to poverty, it seems then that allowing this many people to live in poverty is essentially, it's a political decision then, because there are policies that will make a difference.
Absolutely. There is definitely a political decision. There are policies that could address this, and they are just choosing not to do so. But yeah, sorry, what was what was the
Well,
first part of your
we
question?
talked about some of the policies that we have seen, say, in response to the COVID-19
Oh,
pandemic. There was
right.
the extension of the child income tax credit that
Yes.
significantly impacted many families. I mean, maybe talk about some of those things. And for people who aren't living in low income or in poverty itself, who maybe have a little bit of a buffer,
Mhm.
there's maybe not an understanding of what it means to live so close to the edge. And so when you have even what seems like a relatively small amount being given directly to families, that can make a huge difference. I mean, you've described your own family situation, Angela. So talk a little bit about that, about how it's not even, we're not even talking about a huge amount, particularly when we compare it with how much money is being spent on the war economy, but how much even a small amount can make to what a difference that can make to families like yours.
Yeah, absolutely. So the child tax credit was incredibly helpful to my family. It helped us to get just necessities, things that we were really struggling to get, just things for hygiene and cleaning and things like that, that sometimes are difficult to access if, you're living on a very low income. So yeah, we were really able to um, kind of stock up and get a lot of things necessary to my family. And now that that is gone, we're running low on things like that. And yeah, when you are living on such a low income, it is difficult to, you may not be able to get gas because you can't afford it. So you can't go to wherever it is that you need to go. Um, I mentioned food. When our SNAP money runs out, then we have to rely on family to help us. There's just so many things that people don't really think about day to day because they may not have difficulty accessing them. But they're everything that you do throughout the day that costs money is a struggle for a poor person to access.
And you mentioned earlier about the situation that your husband finds himself in. He's a veteran and he was promised to have his education paid for through the GI Bill. But you've recently gotten a letter saying, well, no, there was some administrative mistake. So now you owe us, I think, something like $20,000. When you get something like that, it completely derails you. But also the issue of student debt is massive as part of the Poor People's Campaign as well. And I know that as part of the ongoing campaign that we've heard the voices of students talking about what it means to live in debt. If your husband had realized that he would have to pay or that he would be liable for more than $20,000 worth of student loans, I mean, what decision would have made around education? Because when you don't have access to resources and you're looking at taking on debt, I know so many people say, I just can't even live with this, so I can't access education that could potentially help me and my family emerge out of poverty. I mean, that's such a limiting factor as well. I mean, talk about the issue of student debt and the cost of education.
Absolutely. So yeah, my husband has said many times since we received that letter that he wishes that he had never joined at all because the promises were not held up. I myself, like I mentioned, I have pretty severe anxiety and I also suffer from chronic pain. So it took me a long time after I got out of the military to be able to feel well enough to go back to college. And in 2020, I was able to go back to college and I was going to get a linguistics degree. And I was about a year into college and I got a letter that my GI Bill benefits expired. And so I was not able to finish that degree, even though it was my disability that made it so that was difficult for me to start school until later. And really just having that amount of debt, I took on just a few student loans to try to continue. And then I ended up quitting because I could not take on any more debt. And that is the case for so many people around the country, that if you just don't have the funds that you need to survive, there's no way that you can take on any sort of debt um, to further yourself in life.
The Poor People's Campaign Moral March on Washington is also a march to the polls. That's part of the title of the event. And because of the power of this voting bloc, because there are millions and millions of people who are in a similar situation to yours, Angela, poverty and living in low income, living day to day. And these are people who are very often working because of, the situation that we find ourselves in, that wages aren't keeping up with inflation and people get trapped in this cycle of poverty. But the march to the polls, I want to talk about that. You spoke a little bit about what's happening in Nebraska with a voter ID law, signatures being gathered right now for a constitutional amendment. We have discussed this many, many times on Free Speech TV about efforts to create barriers for people to vote. There's a massive power in the voting bloc. If you just look at the numbers of people who are impacted by all of these issues that we're talking about, all of the issues that the Poor People's Campaign address. I mean, we're talking about at least a third of voters in Nebraska. So how do we rally people? How do folks like the Poor People's Campaign, organizers like yourself, rally that voting bloc to pass laws that would actually benefit people who are living in poverty? Because we're not seeing those laws being passed. We're not seeing policies being passed. So what's the political element of this?
So I think that it is super important to try to get politicians who speak to the issues of the 140 million poor people in this country. A lot of people do not vote because they don't feel that they are being spoken to, that the politicians are in any way going to help them. And I think it is really important that those people feel that they are heard and go out and vote, and then continue as we are to push the politicians towards the things that will help people in poverty.
We're in a very important midterm election year. And in fact, many primaries are happening as we speak, and going to be happening over the next few weeks. So how do we keep those seeking elected office on message around poverty, around militarism, around environmental degradation, when it seems that so much of the political messaging is really about cultural division? It's about which side are you on when it comes to the big lie or January 6th. Important issues, but it seems that we have lost our way when it comes to keeping our elected officials on point when it comes to very, very important policy issues. How do we get that narrative back?
So I think it's really important to continue to make it clear that the people are they want to hear about these issues. These are the things that are important to them, and to get our vote, to get our support, they need to focus on these issues. Like you said, the things, January 6th and those things are important, but it is really important that we don't focus so much on, division, and actually work on coming together and trying to keep the politicians aware that these are the issues that we care about, and these are what is important to us.
Now, you're in a state that is very conservative. You're in Nebraska, that there will be a lot of focus on some of these other issues. How do you, when you're out and about talking to folks in Nebraska, talking about these issues, poverty, militarism, and how so many people are impacted, how do you start those conversations and get past some of those politically divisive mechanisms that I think are put out there to stop us talking about what essentially unites us?
So I try to talk to people about, issues that we have in common, things that affect so many people that are living in poverty, like access to water, access to food. Um, just it's so many important issues that when you really talk to people, they do agree with you on. It's just, they're kind of divided politically, but when you really sit down and talk to people about the issues affecting them, you find out that they are very much living in similar conditions as you.
What do you ultimately hope will come out of these big events happening June 18th, the moral march on Washington, D.C. and to the polls. How do we keep that energy going, and what do you hope will be a result of it?
So I am really hopeful that we will make it clear that these are the things that the people care about. These are the things that the people want. We are really trying to push for a meeting with President Biden, as he spoke to us when he was a candidate, and kind of promised to address these issues and has not done that yet. So yeah, we would just want to make it very, very clear that these are the things that are important to us, and we want to make it clear that the politicians and the people running need to speak to the people living in poverty, to the over 140 million people in this country that are poor and low income, and know that their issues are heard.
Well, Angela, thank you so much for being our guest on Just Solutions. And I know your work will continue beyond June 18th and the season that we are in. Aside from the voter ID law in Nebraska, all of the issues raised by the Poor People's Campaign, what are some of the issues that you think the wider public needs to know about rural America and states like Nebraska? Because we don't often hear your stories out there in the mainstream.
Right. So I think it's really important to focus on, in Nebraska, I'm really trying to unite the rural part of the state with the urban part of the state in Omaha, because we do share so many issues. And so I'm really just trying to focus on, uniting people and really focusing on the things we have in common. And in the state of Nebraska, I think probably the biggest issue that we have, or one of the biggest, we have many, but our incarceration system is terrible. We have about 48% of the people that are in prison are people of color, and that's just completely disproportionate to our population. And our prisons are overcrowded, and it's just a horrible situation. And I think that is something that people don't hear enough about in Nebraska.
Well, Angela, thank you very much for being our guest today. You're going to be a speaker at the events of June 18th, but your work continues well beyond the Moral March on Washington. Angela, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Free Speech TV has lots and lots of coverage of the Poor People's Campaign, the events on June 18th, the culmination of so many months of organizing. You can find all of that at freespeech.org. And don't forget that Just Solutions is also available as a podcast. So you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, listen anytime and never miss an episode. And join us again, same time, same place next week for another conversation on Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.